Hands where I can see them. The vehicle matches a robbery suspect.
A robbery? This isn't my car. It's a rental. I can reach for my license and registration so you can verify.
Nobody said you could reach for anything. Step out of the vehicle.
Following Officer Blakely's command, Kendra stepped out slowly, leaving the driver's door open behind her. Officer Kaiser checked the passenger seat and froze. A cased pistol sat beside her bag, its carry permit plainly visible.
She's got a gun in the car. Watch her hands.
She remained perfectly still as both officers drew their weapons in unison.
It's secured in the case. I'm not moving. I'm not reaching for anything.
What the two officers didn't know was that the real shock wasn't the gun in the car. It was who Kendra really was. Kendra Vandell turned onto Maple Ridge Lane and felt something in her chest ease for the first time in a year. She knew this street. She'd learned to ride a bike on it. Her mom still lived 4 houses down, in the same brick house with the same crooked mailbox. Kendra had been overseas for months, doing work she couldn't talk about, sleeping when she could, and eating when she remembered to. Now she was home. 2 weeks of leave. 2 weeks of nothing but her mother's cooking and long, quiet mornings. She was thinking about her mother's biscuits when the lights flared up behind her. Red and blue, spinning off her rearview mirror. Kendra's hands didn't shake. She'd been trained not to let her hands shake. She flicked her turn signal, eased onto the shoulder, and put the car in park. Habit made her reach over and tap the small dash camera clipped near her windshield. It blinked once and started recording. She did this every time lights showed up behind her, on base or off. Some habits didn't turn off just because she was home. She rolled her window down and folded her hands on top of the wheel where they could be seen. 2 officers stepped out of the patrol car. Both had their guns already out, not resting in the holster. Out. Pointed low, but out. "Hands where I can see them," the bigger one shouted. He had a thick beard and a voice like gravel scraping concrete. His nameplate read, Blakely. "They're right here," Kendra said. Calm, steady. "What's this about, officer? Don't you get smart with me." Blakely stepped closer, weapon still raised. "Vehicle matches a robbery suspect." "What robbery? What vehicle?" Kendra kept her voice even. "This is a rental. I've had it 2 days. I said don't get smart." Blakely's partner, a leaner man with Kaiser stitched above his pocket, circled around to the passenger side, weapon shaking slightly in his grip. His eyes kept darting through the glass, scanning her lap, the console, the seat beside her. "License and registration's in the glove box," Kendra said. "I'm going to reach for it slow." "Nobody said you could reach for anything," Blakely barked. "You just asked for my—" "I said hands!" Kendra's stomach tightened, but her face stayed still. She'd been in rooms with men who wanted her dead. She knew what panic looked like on a person's face, and she was looking at it now, on both of them. Panic with a badge and a loaded gun was worse than panic with nothing at all. "Step out of the vehicle," Blakely said. "Sir, can you tell me why I'm being stopped? I haven't broken any—" "Step. Out." Kendra opened the door slow, both hands raised, and stepped onto the pavement, leaving the door open behind her. The afternoon sun was warm on her neck. A few houses down, a sprinkler ticked back and forth across somebody's lawn like nothing in the world was wrong. "You don't belong on this street," Blakely said, low, almost to himself, but loud enough that she heard every word. "Driving a car like that. Around here." Kendra's jaw tightened. She said nothing. Talking back now would only give him what he wanted. Kaiser leaned toward the open passenger window to check the console for weapons. Standard procedure drilled into him, and froze. On the passenger seat, resting in its case beside her travel bag, sat a pistol, and next to it, clipped to a folder, a printed carry permit in her name. "Gun!" Kaiser screamed, jerking back upright, weapon snapping toward Kendra. "She's got a gun in the car! Watch her hands!" "It's secured in the case," Kendra said, keeping her hands raised, motionless. "I'm not moving. I'm not reaching for anything." "Get down! Get down now!" Both men raised their weapons at once. 2 barrels, level with her chest, less than 10 feet away. Blakely's fingers slid onto the trigger guard. Kaiser's hands were shaking so badly, the muzzle of his gun wobbled. Kendra didn't move. Not yet. She had exactly 1/2 of 1 second to make a choice that would decide whether she walked away from this street or didn't. Every hour of training she'd ever survived collapsed down into that half-second. Every drill, every close call, every lesson about what a body does under a gun when panic takes over the men holding it. She looked at Blakely's finger. She looked at Kaiser's shaking hands. And Kendra Vandell decided she was not going to die on Maple Ridge Lane. 2 guns, 10 feet, her hands empty and raised in the open air. Kendra's mind went quiet, the way it always did right before something happened. Not fear, just stillness, a kind of narrow, clean focus that blocked out the sprinkler ticking down the street and the sound of her own heartbeat. Blakely's finger tightened on the trigger guard. She moved. It wasn't fast the way the movies show fast. It was efficient. 1 step, low and sideways, closing the distance instead of running from it, because a moving target 10 feet away is a threat. But a body inside your reach is just a body. And Kendra had spent years learning what to do with a body inside her reach. Her hand closed over the slide and barrel of Blakely's weapon before his brain caught up to what his eyes were seeing. She twisted, hard, driving the muzzle down and away from her own chest at the same instant she stepped into him, using his own weight against his balance. The gun came free in her hand. Blakely stumbled back, mouth open, both hands suddenly empty and grasping at air where his weapon used to be. Kaiser's gun was still up, still shaking, aimed somewhere between Kendra and his partner, his brain clearly unable to process what he'd just watched happen in under 2 seconds. Kendra didn't point Blakely's gun at either man. She could have. She thought about it for exactly no time at all, because that wasn't the point. And some part of her, some cold, disciplined part built by years of training, already knew exactly what she needed to do instead. She dropped the muzzle toward the pavement, right at Blakely's feet, and fired once. The shot cracked off the asphalt between his boots. He jerked backward with a strangled shout, tripping over his own feet, landing hard on the pavement. Silence rang out after it. Even the sprinkler seemed to pause. "That's what it sounds like," Kendra said, voice flat and even, "when someone actually wants to hurt you." She could have put that round through his chest. She could have put 2 through Kaiser before he ever pulled his trigger the rest of the way. Everyone standing on that street would understand that in about 10 more seconds once their brains caught back up. She had proven something in under 3 seconds that no amount of talking ever could have. She was not the danger they'd decided she was. She was something far more controlled than that, and far more dangerous, if she'd wanted to be. "Drop it!" Kaiser's voice cracked, gun still raised on her, hands shaking worse now. "Drop the weapon! Drop it right now!" Kendra crouched, slow, deliberate, and set Blakely's gun on the pavement in front of her, sliding it away with her foot. "It's down," she said. "I'm not armed. Look at my hands." Blakely scrambled up off the ground, face red, fury and humiliation twisting his features into something ugly. "You just assaulted an officer! I disarmed a man who had his finger on the trigger, pointed at an unarmed civilian standing with her hands up," Kendra said. "There's a difference, and there's a camera on my dash that's going to show it." That landed. She watched it land, watched something flicker behind Blakely's eyes. Some first flash of understanding that this had not gone the way he planned, that whatever story he'd meant to write about this stop had just been rewritten in front of witnesses. "Get on your knees," he screamed instead, snatching his gun back up off the pavement with a shaking hand. "Get down! Now!" Kendra lowered herself to her knees on the hot asphalt, hands laced behind her head, without being told twice. She'd already made her point. Fighting further would only give them a version of the story where she looked like the danger. She'd learned that lesson in rooms far worse than this one. Sometimes the strongest move was letting them think they'd won. Sirens grew louder down the block. More lights, more doors slamming. A neighbor 2 houses down had stepped onto her porch, phone raised, filming everything. Kendra knelt on the pavement, wrists soon wrapped tight in zip ties by an officer who wouldn't meet her eyes, and watched more patrol cars pull up around her like a wall closing in. Neighbors gathered at the edges of their lawns now, phones out, whispering to each other. Somewhere behind her, she heard Blakely on his radio, voice still shaking as he called for backup he clearly hadn't expected to need. Kendra knelt on the hot pavement, wrists cinched tight behind her, and watched her whole street fill up with strangers in uniform. 4 more patrol cars had arrived. Officers spilled out of them, hands on their belts, unsure yet what they were walking into. One of them, older, with sergeant's stripes on his sleeve, jogged over to Blakely and Kaiser, who were both talking at once, words tumbling over each other. "She disarmed him," Kaiser was saying, voice too high, too fast. "Right in front of me. Had his gun and fired it before I could even—" "I know what I saw," the sergeant snapped. "Somebody searched the vehicle." 2 officers approached Kendra's rental car. One leaned in through the open passenger door, checking the console where the pistol case still sat, exactly where it had been the whole time. Permit clipped neatly to the folder beside it. The other officer moved to the trunk and popped it open. Kendra watched from her knees, saying nothing. There was nothing to say. The truth was sitting right there in that trunk, waiting to be found. And she'd learned a long time ago that innocent people didn't need to talk their way out of anything. The evidence would do that work for her. "Sarge!" The officer at the trunk straightened up fast, holding a folded set of orders in one hand. "You need to see this." The sergeant crossed over, took the papers, and went quiet as he read them. His eyebrows pulled together. He flipped to the 2nd page, then the 3rd. "What is it?" Blakely called over, still catching his breath. The sergeant didn't answer right away. He walked to the open duffel bag in the trunk and pulled back the flap. Inside, folded on top of a change of civilian clothes, sat a unit patch. Worn, faded at the edges from use, the kind of patch that didn't come from a surplus store. Beside it, a military ID card with Kendra's photo, her name, and a designation that made the sergeant's face change color. "She's Army," he said slowly. "Special Operations. This says—" He stopped himself, glancing at Kendra, then back at the papers, like the words were too heavy to say out loud in front of the growing crowd of neighbors. Blakely's face had gone pale under the red flush of his earlier anger. "That doesn't change anything." "She disarmed you in under 2 seconds and put a warning round at your feet instead of your chest," the sergeant said, low and hard. "You understand what that means? If she'd wanted you dead, Blakely, you'd be dead." The radio on the sergeant's shoulder crackled with more chatter. Other units checking in. Someone asking for a supervisor. The word Delta had started moving through the small crowd of officers like a current, passed low from one to the next, each of them glancing back at Kendra kneeling calm and silent on the pavement like she wasn't the one who should have been afraid. Down the sidewalk, a woman in a bathrobe stood on her porch, phone still raised, still recording. She'd been out there since the first shot cracked off the pavement, capturing everything. The raised weapons, Blakely's voice telling Kendra she didn't belong on this street, the warning shot, the zip ties. Her thumb hadn't moved off the record button once. An officer noticed her and started walking over, badge out, hand extended for the phone. "Ma'am, I'm going to need that as evidence." The sergeant, still holding Kendra's military orders, looked between the trembling weapon on the ground, the frightened officers, and the woman kneeling calmly in the street, who clearly wasn't the threat anyone had described on the radio. "Cut her loose," he said finally. An officer stepped behind Kendra and sliced through the zip ties. She rolled her wrists slowly, feeling the blood come back into her hands, and rose to her feet without being told to. No charges, no arrest, just silence, and a street full of officers who didn't know where to look. Behind her, the woman on the porch was still holding her phone up, and an officer's hand was still reaching for it. Chief Walter Oscar's phone rang while he was still at his desk finishing lunch. He picked it up on the second ring. "Oscar." "Chief, we've got a situation." It was the sergeant from Maple Ridge Lane, voice tight. "Officer involved, stop. No shots fired at a civilian, but a warning round was discharged. The subject disarmed one of our officers." Oscar set down his sandwich. "Disarmed him? You mean took his weapon?" "Yes, sir, and there's more. She's active duty Army, Special Operations, Delta." Oscar was quiet for a moment, doing the math in his head the way he did with every problem that landed on his desk. Not what happened, but what it would cost him if the wrong version got out first. "Is she in custody?" "No, sir. We released her. Wasn't a legal basis to hold her once the search came back clean, and there's already a witness with video. Get me that video." "We're working on it, sir." Oscar hung up and sat back in his chair, staring at the wall for a long moment. 22 years he'd built this department. 2 officers with shaky trigger fingers were not going to be the thing that tore it down. He picked the phone back up. By the time he reached the station an hour later, he already had a plan. He called Blakely and Kaiser into his office first, one at a time, and told each of them exactly what their written statements needed to say. Not lies, he told himself. Just the right emphasis. The subject had reached toward a weapon. The subject had refused verbal commands. The subject had assaulted an officer and discharged a firearm during a lawful stop. He didn't write the word lawful into either report himself, but he made sure it landed there anyway, once, twice, 3 times, until the shape of the story was set in stone before either officer left the room. Then he called the officer who'd approached the woman on the porch. "Where's the phone?" "She wouldn't hand it over voluntarily, Chief. Said it was her personal property." "We didn't have a warrant, so I couldn't force it." Oscar's jaw tightened. That was a problem he'd deal with later, one way or another. For now, there was still time to make sure the department's version reached the public first, before any footage did. He picked up the phone one more time and dialed a number he knew from memory. A local news producer who owed him a favor from a story that never ran 2 years back. "I've got something for you," Oscar said. "Officer-involved incident. Maple Ridge Lane. Subject brandished a weapon, resisted, assaulted an officer during a traffic stop. We're still gathering facts, but I wanted you to have it early." He paused, choosing his next words with care. "She does have a military background. I'd be careful how that gets framed. We don't want to make a hero out of someone who put 2 of my officers in danger." He hung up and leaned back in his chair, satisfied. By 6 o'clock, the story would run exactly the way he needed it to run. Cautious, careful, full of words like alleged and reportedly that would still leave the right impression sitting in people's minds. Brandished, resisted, assaulted. Nobody would ask why 2 officers had their weapons drawn on an unarmed woman standing with her hands raised. Nobody would ask why the gun in question had been locked in a case on the passenger seat the whole time. By the time anyone thought to ask those questions, the department's version would already be the one people remembered. Oscar picked his sandwich back up, took a bite, and looked out his office window at the parking lot below, where Blakely was climbing into his patrol car, still rattled, still pale. It would be fine, Oscar told himself. It always was. He didn't know yet about the dashboard camera clipped near Kendra Vandel's windshield, quietly recording every second of the stop from an angle none of his officers had thought to check. He didn't know that somewhere across town, a decorated soldier was sitting at her mother's kitchen table with ice on her wrists, watching his lie about to be told on the 6 o'clock news. Kendra sat at her mother's kitchen table with a bag of frozen peas pressed against one wrist and a glass of water she hadn't touched in front of her. Her mother, Darcy, hovered near the stove, arms crossed tight over her chest, the way she used to stand when Kendra was little, and came home from school with a scraped knee she wouldn't admit hurt. She hadn't said much since Kendra walked through the door that afternoon. She'd just pulled out the peas, filled the water glass, and turned the television on low in the next room, the way she always did when she needed something to fill the silence. "You should eat something," Darcy said. "I'm not hungry, Mom." "You should eat something anyway." Kendra almost smiled. Some things never changed, no matter how many years passed or how many miles she put between herself and this kitchen. The television flickered in the next room, and something in the anchor's tone caught Kendra's attention before she even understood the words. She got up, peas still pressed to her wrist, and walked to the doorway. Chief Walter Oscar stood behind a podium on the screen, hands folded, voice calm and careful in the way of a man who had rehearsed every syllable. During a lawful traffic stop, the subject reportedly brandished a weapon and resisted officers' commands, Oscar was saying. One officer discharged his firearm during the encounter. We are still gathering all the facts, but I want to reassure this community that our officers responded appropriately to protect themselves and the public. Kendra stood frozen in the doorway, the peas dripping cold water onto the floor. "That's not what happened," she said quietly. "What?" Darcy stepped up beside her, following her gaze to the screen. "That's not what happened, Mom." Kendra's voice was low, controlled, but something underneath it had gone tight and hard. "He's telling the whole town I pulled a gun on them. I never touched a gun until I took his. Baby, sit down before you fall down." Darcy reached for her arm. Kendra didn't move. She watched Oscar finish his statement, watched him step away from the podium without taking questions, watched the anchor cut back to the studio and say the word alleged 3 separate times in under a minute, like it was supposed to mean something, like it softened anything at all when the department had already decided which version people were going to believe. Her phone buzzed in her back pocket. She pulled it out, expecting another reporter, another number she didn't recognize. Instead, the name on the screen made her chest go tight in a different way entirely. Colonel Theodore. She stepped away from the television and answered the message instead of calling, thumb hovering over the screen for a second before she read it. Saw a clip online. Heard the rest through the grapevine already. Word travels fast when it's you, Vandel. Whatever you're about to do it like you're still under my command. Slow. Precise. No wasted rounds. You know how this works. Don't let them turn you into the story they need you to be. Kendra read it twice. She thought about the range back at Bragg, Theodore standing behind her with his arms crossed, watching her put round after round through a target the size of a fist from 200 yards, never once raising his voice, never once needing to. He'd taught her that control wasn't about restraint for its own sake. It was a weapon, same as anything else. You just had to know how to aim it. She looked back at the television, now running a commercial for a car dealership like nothing at all had happened on Maple Ridge Lane that afternoon. Then she looked at her phone again, at Theodore's words glowing on the screen. Darcy was still watching her, worry carved deep into her face. "Kendra, what are you going to do?" Kendra set the bag of peas down on the counter. Her wrist still ached, faint bruises already forming where the zip ties had bitten in, but her hands were steady now in a way they hadn't been an hour ago. "I'm going to make sure they regret starting this," she said. Outside, the sun was going down over Maple Ridge Lane, the same street she'd driven down that morning with nothing but her mother's biscuits on her mind. Now, the whole town believed a lie. And somewhere across the city, Chief Oscar was probably pouring himself a drink. Certain the matter was already closed. He had no idea it had only just begun. 2 days passed before Kendra learned what had happened to the woman on the porch. She'd spent those 2 days mostly indoors, watching the story grow legs on local news, feeling the weight of strangers' opinions pile up on her shoulders like sandbags. Neighbors she'd known her whole life crossed the street to avoid her. Others stopped by with casseroles and quiet words of support, unsure which version of the story to believe, but sure enough of Kendra to bring food anyway. Her mother's phone rang constantly. Reporters, mostly, none of whom Kendra was ready to talk to yet. It was a neighbor, an older woman named Roxane, who lived 2 doors down from where the stop happened, who finally told her the truth over the fence one afternoon. That girl who filmed it. Poor thing. Roxane shook her head, arms folded over her garden gloves. Officers showed up at her door the next morning, told her the footage was evidence in an active investigation, said she could be charged with obstruction if she didn't hand over her phone or delete what she had. Scared her half to death. She's 22, Kendra. She deleted it right in front of him. Kendra's stomach dropped. The one piece of outside proof gone, and with it, most people's only reason to doubt the department's story. But something loosened in her chest at the same time, some cold and steady certainty settling into place, because Roxane didn't know what Kendra knew. Roxane didn't know about the small black camera clipped near the top of her windshield. She'd installed it years ago, after her first deployment. When a friend on her team had come home to find himself facing charges nobody could disprove without footage of what had actually happened downrange. Since then, the habit had followed her everywhere. Lights behind her, camera on. It wasn't paranoia. It was just what she did now, the same way she checked exits in restaurants and kept her back to the wall. That night, after her mother had gone to bed, Kendra sat alone at the kitchen table with her laptop open and the rental car's dash camera connected by a cable running across the table like a lifeline. She watched the whole thing back once, all the way through, her jaw tightening with every second. Blakely's voice, sharp and certain, telling her she didn't belong on this street. The wobble of Kaiser's gun. Her own hands raised, steady, patient, right up until the moment they weren't patient anymore. It was all there. Every second of it, time-stamped, unedited, undeniable. She thought about sending the whole thing to Colonel Theodore. She thought about walking it straight into the police station and slamming it down on Oscar's desk. Instead, she sat with it a long moment, remembering his text. Slow, precise. No wasted rounds. If she released everything at once, the department would find a way to explain it away, spin it, delay it, drown it in lawyers and procedure the way departments always did. But if she gave them just enough to make Oscar's careful little story fall apart in public, they wouldn't know how much more she had. They'd be forced to react without knowing what they were reacting to. She trimmed the footage down to 40 seconds. Just enough to show the raised weapons, just enough to show her hands lifted and empty, just enough to catch Blakely's voice saying, "You don't belong on this street clear as day." She left out the disarm. She left out the warning shot. Let them wonder what else was coming. At 11 that night, she posted it. By midnight, it had 10,000 views. By 2 in the morning, it had 10 times that, shared and reshared across the city. Comments piling up faster than she could read them. Most of them furious, some of them disbelieving, all of them asking the same question the local news anchor hadn't dared to ask out loud. Why did 2 officers draw their weapons on a woman standing with empty hands? Kendra closed her laptop a little after 3 and sat in the dark kitchen a long moment, listening to the house settle around her. She didn't know yet that across town, Chief Oscar's phone was already ringing off the hook, reporters demanding comment on a video that directly contradicted his official statement. She only knew that, for the first time since the stop, the story didn't belong to him anymore. By 7 the next morning, Chief Oscar had already watched the clip 11 times. He sat behind his desk with the door closed, replaying the 40 seconds over and over, searching for an angle he could work with. There wasn't one. 2 officers, weapons raised, aimed at a woman with her hands lifted and empty. Her voice on the recording, calm and clear, asking why she'd been stopped. Blakely's voice, unmistakable, telling her she didn't belong on that street. His phone had not stopped ringing since 6. He called Blakely and Kaiser into his office before either of them had finished their coffee. "Sit," he said, and they sat. "This footage is a problem," Oscar said. "Not because of what's on it, because of how it makes us look before we've had a chance to control the story." "Chief, I told you what happened," Blakely said, leaning forward. "She reached for a weapon. She assaulted me. That's the truth. I know what you told me." Oscar's voice stayed flat. "I need your written statements to match." "Exactly. Both of you." She reached toward a firearm in the vehicle. "You gave verbal commands. She failed to comply. She then physically assaulted you and discharged a weapon in your direction before you could respond." Kaiser shifted in his seat. "The round didn't come near either of us. It hit the pavement by his feet. It was discharged during a violent encounter with law enforcement," Oscar said, like that settled the matter entirely. "That's what your report says. Am I clear?" Neither man argued further. They knew which way the wind needed to blow if they wanted to keep their jobs, their pensions, their names off the front page as anything other than the wronged party. By that afternoon, both reports sat on Oscar's desk, worded almost identically, and he'd already begun drafting something far more useful than a press statement. An internal investigation, not into his officer's conduct, but into Kendra Vandell. He justified it to himself the way he justified most things now, as simple procedure. A civilian had physically disarmed a sworn officer and fired a weapon during a police stop. That warranted review regardless of the circumstances. It didn't matter that the weapons had been raised first. It didn't matter that her hands had been empty the entire time. On paper, procedure didn't care about any of that. And Oscar had learned a long time ago that paper was the only thing that mattered once a story reached a courtroom. He signed the order that afternoon and had it mailed the same day. Kendra found the envelope in her mother's mailbox 2 mornings later. Official department letterhead stamped across the top, her name typed cold and formal beneath a case number. She stood on the porch and read it twice. Notice of internal investigation. Subject, Kendra Marie Vandell. Regarding assault on a law enforcement officer. Unlawful discharge of a firearm during police encounter. Her hands didn't shake reading it. But something colder than anger settled into her chest. Something that felt almost like disbelief, even though she'd known this was coming the moment she saw Oscar's face on the news 2 nights before. They weren't just protecting Blakely and Kaiser. They were building a case against her. Against the person who'd been stopped for nothing, threatened for nothing, and had shown more restraint in 3 seconds than either officer had shown in the entire encounter. She carried the letter inside and set it on the kitchen table in front of her mother, who read it in silence, her mouth pressed into a thin, furious line by the time she finished. "They can't do this," Darcy said. "They drew on you first. Everybody in this town saw the video. They can do whatever they write down on paper, Mom." Kendra sat across from her, staring at the case number like it might rearrange itself into something less frightening if she looked at it long enough. That's how this works. Whoever controls the paperwork controls the story, unless somebody makes them answer to something bigger than paperwork. She thought of Theodore's text again. Slow, precise. No wasted rounds. She'd already spent 1 round wisely, and it had cracked Oscar's story right down the middle in front of the whole town. It wasn't enough. Not if he could turn around and make her the villain in his own department's version of events. She needed someone outside the department. Someone who couldn't be quieted with a phone call or a favor. Someone whose job was asking the exact questions Oscar didn't want asked out loud. Kendra folded the letter, tucked it into her bag, and reached for her phone. Tessa Maddow had built her name on stories other reporters were too cautious to touch. Kendra found her through a series of articles from the year before. A piece on a warehouse that ignored safety violations until a worker lost 2 fingers. Another on a landlord who let mold grow through a building full of families because repairs cost money he didn't want to spend. Maddow wrote plainly, without softening the truth to protect anyone powerful. That was exactly what Kendra needed. She called the number listed under Maddow's byline and left a message. Maddow called back within the hour. They met the next morning at a small coffee shop 2 towns over, far enough from Maple Ridge Lane that nobody would recognize either of them. Maddow arrived first, a notebook already open on the table, a recorder set beside it, her eyes sharp and steady in a way that told Kendra this wasn't the first hard conversation she'd ever had over a cup of coffee. "Walk me through it," Maddow said. "All of it. Start to finish." Kendra did. She kept her voice even, laying out the stop exactly as it happened. The weapons raised over nothing. The gun locked safely in its case on the passenger seat the whole time. The disarm, the warning shot, the zip ties, and now the internal investigation aimed squarely at her instead of the officers who'd drawn first. Maddow's pen moved fast across her notebook, but she looked up sharply at one detail. "You have footage beyond the 40 seconds you posted." "I do. Are you going to give it to me?" Kendra hesitated only a moment. "Not yet. Not all of it." Maddow studied her for a long second, then nodded slowly, like she understood exactly what kind of game Kendra was playing and respected it. "Smart. Give me what I can verify without burning your whole hand at once." Kendra handed over the partial clip, along with copies of her military ID and deployment orders, enough for Maddow to confirm her service record through channels the department couldn't quietly bury the way they'd buried the footage from the woman on the porch. Maddow spent the better part of that afternoon making calls, checking records, cross-referencing timestamps against the department's own public statements. By evening, she had what she needed. The article ran 2 days later under Maddow's byline, plain and direct. No softening language, no allegedly this or reportedly that, scattered through every sentence to protect the department from its own words. It laid the contradiction out for anyone to see. Chief Oscar's public statement claiming Kendra had brandished a weapon, set directly beside verified video showing her hands raised and empty, while 2 officers pointed loaded guns at her chest. It included her military record. It included the fact that the only outside witness had been pressured by an officer into deleting her footage under threat of obstruction charges. The story spread fast. By the next morning, it wasn't just local anymore. Other outlets picked it up, drawn by the contradiction between video and official statement, by the uncomfortable question sitting underneath all of it. Comment sections filled with outrage. People who'd never heard of Maple Ridge Lane were suddenly sharing the clip, tagging the department, demanding answers. Kendra sat at her mother's kitchen table reading through it all, feeling something shift in her chest for the first time since the letter about the internal investigation had arrived. It wasn't relief, not yet, but it was momentum. And momentum was something she understood how to use. Her phone rang that afternoon. Maddo's name on the screen. "You're not going to believe this," Maddo said, and Kendra could hear the edge of satisfaction in her voice. District Attorney's Office just put out a statement. Grace Halton's opening a formal review into the incident. Kendra closed her eyes for a second, letting the words land. "They can't ignore it anymore," Maddo went on. "Not with this much attention on it. Not with your record backing up every second of that footage. What happens now? Now the DA's office starts digging. And people like Oscar hate nothing more than somebody digging where they can't control what gets found." Kendra thanked her and hung up, sitting in the quiet kitchen a long moment. For the first time since two guns had been raised on her in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, the story had stopped belonging entirely to the people who wanted to bury her. It belonged, at least a little, to the truth now, too. She thought of Oscar somewhere across town, reading the same article, realizing the version of events he'd built so carefully was starting to come apart in public. One verified fact at a time. Good, she thought. Let it. 3 nights after Tessa Maddo's article ran, Darcy called Kendra outside just after 10 o'clock. "There's a car," her mother said quietly, standing at the front window with the curtain pulled back an inch. "Been by twice now. Slow, both times. No lights on." Kendra crossed the living room and looked past her mother's shoulder. A dark sedan idled at the end of the block, headlights off despite the dark, engine running low and steady. She watched it for a long moment, every instinct she'd built over years of deployments quietly sharpening into focus. "Get away from the window, Mom." "Kendra, please." Darcy stepped back. Kendra stayed at the edge of the curtain, watching as the sedan rolled forward, slow, deliberate, past the house at a crawl that had nothing to do with looking for an address. As it passed beneath the streetlight 2 doors down, she caught the driver's profile clear enough to recognize. Blakely. He wasn't in uniform. The car wasn't marked. But it was him, unmistakably. Jaw set tight, eyes fixed on the house as he passed. He didn't stop. He didn't get out. He simply drove past, slow enough to be seen, slow enough to make sure she knew exactly who was watching her mother's house at 10 o'clock at night. And then he turned the corner and was gone. Kendra stood at the window a long moment after the taillights disappeared, feeling something cold settle behind her ribs that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with fury. This wasn't about the stop anymore. Wasn't about a report or an internal investigation or a news article. This was Blakely, off the clock, using an unmarked car to remind her that he knew exactly where her mother slept at night. She could have called the police. The thought crossed her mind and left again just as fast, bitter as it went, because calling the police on an officer intimidating her felt like handing a wolf a phone number for the henhouse. Instead, she did what she'd been trained to do. She observed. She noted the make and model of the sedan, the partial plate she'd caught under the streetlight, the direction he'd turned at the corner, the time on her phone down to the minute. She wrote it all down at the kitchen table while her mother sat across from her, arms wrapped tight around herself, worry etched deep into every line of her face. "He's trying to scare us," Darcy said. "He's trying to scare me," Kendra corrected, "and he's using you to do it, because he knows that'll work faster than anything he could do to me directly." "Will it?" Kendra reached across the table and took her mother's hand. "No," she said, and meant it. It's going to do the opposite. The sedan passed the house a second time 20 minutes later. Same slow crawl, same dark windows. Kendra photographed it this time, capturing the plate more clearly through the gap in the curtain. Timestamp glowing in the corner of the image. She understood exactly what this meant. Laid out plain in her mind the way a threat assessment would read on paper back at Bragg. Oscar's cover-up had cracked in public. Blakely and Kaiser were facing consequences for the first time since the stop. And rather than accept that consequence, rather than face what he'd done, Blakely had chosen to escalate. Quietly, personally, aimed now at the one person who couldn't defend herself the way Kendra could. That told her everything she needed to know about the kind of man she was dealing with. A man who drew his weapon on an unarmed woman for no reason wasn't going to stop just because a news article embarrassed him. He was going to push harder in the dark, where he thought nobody was watching. But Kendra had spent years learning how to watch things that didn't want to be seen. She sat at the table long after her mother finally went to bed, looking at the photograph of the sedan glowing on her phone screen, turning over exactly what she intended to do with it. This wasn't going to the local news. This wasn't going to Tessa Maddow, not yet. This was going somewhere with real teeth. She thought of the letter still sitting in her bag. The case number stamped cold across the top. The internal investigation Oscar had opened against her instead of his own officers. And she thought of a name Maddow had mentioned in passing during their interview. District Attorney Grace Halton. The one person in this whole mess whose job it was to answer to something bigger than the department's reputation. Tomorrow, Kendra decided. Tomorrow, she'd walk this straight into Halton's office herself. Grace Halton's office sat on the third floor of the county courthouse, a corner room with tall windows and stacks of case files that told Kendra everything she needed to know about how busy the woman actually was before they'd even shaken hands. Halton was younger than Kendra expected, sharp-eyed, dressed plain and practical. The kind of person who looked like she measured every word before she let it leave her mouth. She gestured Kendra into a chair across from her desk and folded her hands on top of a manila folder already sitting there, thick with printed pages. "I've seen the footage," Halton said. "Read the article. My office opened a review 3 days ago." "Then you know what happened," Kendra said. "But you don't know what's happening now." She laid the photograph of the sedan on the desk, the timestamp glowing clear in the corner, followed by her written notes. The plate, the route, the 2 slow passes down her mother's street the night before. She explained who was driving, and watched Halton's face tighten as the pieces landed. "Officer Blakely drove past your mother's house. Twice. Off duty. Unmarked vehicle." "Yes." "Did he make contact? Threaten you directly?" "No. He didn't need to. He just wanted us to know he could." Halton sat back, jaw tight, and made a note on the folder in front of her. "That's intimidation of a witness in an active review. I can add this to the file. It strengthens the pattern significantly." She paused. "I have to be careful here, Ms. Vandal. This department has a lot of political weight behind it. I can't move on assumptions. I need everything airtight." "I understand." Kendra held her gaze. "I'm not asking you to move on assumptions. I'm asking you to keep building the file until it's too heavy to ignore." Halton studied her a long moment, then nodded once, slow. "I can do that." Kendra's phone rang that evening while she sat on her mother's porch, watching the street for headlights that never returned. Colonel Theodore's name lit up the screen. "I made some calls," he said, without wasting time on hello. "You're not going to like what I've found. Tell me anyway. This isn't Blakely and Kaiser's first stop like this. I talked to a friend who still has contacts in that county. 2 years ago, a family filed a complaint against the same 2 officers after a similar stop. No injuries, no shots fired, but the same pattern. Guns drawn over nothing. The complaint went to Oscar's desk directly. And? And it disappeared. No investigation. No discipline. The family was told there wasn't enough evidence to proceed. Theodore's voice hardened. Oscar's cozy with the County Sheriff's Association. There's an election cycle coming up for a seat on that board, and word is he's been positioning himself for it for over a year. A department full of use-of-force complaints doesn't help that campaign, so he buries them instead of fixing them. Kendra sat with that for a long moment, staring out at the dark street. This wasn't two officers with bad instincts and worse tempers. This was a system, built and maintained by a man at the very top, who cared more about his own political future than the people his department was supposed to protect. He's not just covering for Blakely and Kaiser, she said slowly. He's been doing this for years. Looks that way. She thanked Theodore and hung up, sitting in the dark a long while, turning the shape of the whole thing over in her mind. Bigger than she'd thought. Bigger than a corrupt cover-up after one bad stop. An entire pattern, protected by a chief with something to lose if the truth ever fully surfaced. She thought about the full dashcam footage still sitting untouched on her laptop, only 40 seconds of it ever released to the public. She thought about Blakely's slow, deliberate passes down her mother's street, meant to frighten her into silence. The next morning, Kendra drove to the precinct herself. She walked in through the front doors, calm and steady, and asked to speak with Officer Blakely and Officer Kaiser directly. When they came out, wary, flanked by another officer who clearly didn't know what to make of the situation, Kendra held up her phone and let them see. Just for a second, just long enough, a paused frame from the full footage neither of them knew still existed. Blakely's face went pale as recognition crossed it. "There's more than what I posted," Kendra said quietly. "A lot more. You should think carefully about what happens next." She turned and walked out without waiting for a response. By that afternoon, word had reached Chief Oscar. By evening, faced with the growing DA review, the added intimidation complaint, and now the threat of footage he couldn't control, Oscar suspended both officers without pay, pending investigation. Grace Halton announced the next morning that her office would be taking the case to a grand jury. For the first time since the stop, Kendra allowed herself to believe it might actually be over. For 3 days, it felt like winning. The mayor's office called first, an aide with a careful, practiced voice asking if Kendra would be willing to sit down and talk about police reform, about her experience, about what changes the department might need going forward. Kendra said yes, cautious but hopeful, because for the first time since Maple Ridge Lane, someone in power seemed to be listening instead of covering. Tessa Maddow called next, buzzing with the kind of energy Kendra hadn't heard from her before. Suspended without pay, grand jury announced, and now the mayor's office wants your input on reform. Oscar's cornered Kendra. This is what winning looks like. Kendra let herself believe it, just for those 3 days. She let herself imagine what it would feel like to walk down Maple Ridge Lane again without a knot in her stomach. She let her mother breathe easier, let the porch light stay off at night because the sedan hadn't returned since Blakely's suspension. She should have known better. Oscar didn't survive 22 years running that department by giving up when he was cornered. The story broke on a Thursday morning, splashed across the same local news outlet that had run Oscar's original statement 2 weeks before. Decorated veterans past training incident raises questions. Kendra read it, standing at her mother's kitchen counter, coffee going cold in her hand, each sentence landing like a fresh, deliberate wound. The article referenced a sealed disciplinary file from years earlier, a training incident during her early years in the Army, twisted and reshaped until it read nothing like what it actually was. Words like unstable and history of excessive force were dropped in without context, without explanation, just close enough to her name to make readers wonder. Nobody outside the military had access to that file. Nobody except someone with connections deep enough to pull strings. Oscar had clearly known exactly which strings to pull. Kendra called Theodore immediately, voice tight. "They got my training file." "How?" "I don't know yet," Theodore said, and she could hear the anger in his voice too, sharp and controlled the way his anger always was. "But I intend to find out." By that afternoon, the damage had already spread. Comment sections that had once been full of outrage on her behalf now filled with doubt instead. People who'd shared her story a week earlier were suddenly sharing this one, asking different questions now, uglier ones. The mayor's aide called to postpone their meeting indefinitely. Tessa Maddow called to say her editor had pulled her planned follow-up piece under legal pressure from the department's attorneys, worried about liability if the story turned out to cut both ways. Then came the call from Grace Halton's office. "I'm sorry," Halton said. And she did sound sorry, tired in a way that told Kendra this wasn't entirely her decision. The grand jury's being postponed, pending further evidence review. "I can't move forward with something this size, while a credibility question is actively circulating in the press." "It's not a credibility question," Kendra said. "It's a smear. That file's sealed for a reason, and whatever's in it isn't what they're implying." "I believe you," Halton said. "But belief isn't evidence, and right now, that's all I have to work with." By evening, the final blow landed. Blakely and Kaiser were reinstated with full back pay, the department citing insufficient grounds to continue their suspension, while their accuser's own credibility remained in question. Kendra sat alone at the kitchen table that night, long after her mother had gone to bed, staring at her phone, at the article, at all of it collapsing exactly the way Oscar must have planned it from the moment he realized he couldn't outrun the truth in public. She thought about the woman on the porch who'd been scared into deleting her footage. She thought about the family 2 years ago whose complaint had simply disappeared. She thought about how many times this exact thing had probably happened before, quiet and buried. Nobody left standing who was willing to fight back the way she could. She wasn't done. Not even close. But for the first time since this began, she understood she was completely alone in it. No journalist, no DA, no mayor's office standing beside her anymore. Just her, and whatever she still had left to use. She opened her phone and typed a message to Theodore, thumb hovering over the screen for a long moment before she sent it. "They found my training file. They didn't find my rifle." 3 dots appeared almost instantly. Theodore was typing back. Colonel Theodore arrived at Darcy's front door the next morning, dressed plain, a small travel bag over one shoulder, looking like a man who hadn't slept much on the flight in. "You didn't have to come," Kendra said, opening the door wide. "Yes, I did." He stepped inside, glancing around the small living room before his eyes settled back on her. "You've been fighting this alone since the moment I texted you to fight it, right? That ends now." They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Kendra had read Oscar's press statement, where she'd read the letter announcing the internal investigation against her, where she'd typed the message that brought Theodore here in the first place. Her mother set 2 cups of coffee down between them and quietly left the room, understanding without being told that this conversation needed space. "Walk me through everything you've got," Theodore said. "All of it. Don't leave anything out." Kendra opened her laptop and pulled up the full dashcam footage, playing it through from start to finish for him. Theodore watched in silence, jaw tightening at the sound of Blakely's voice telling her she didn't belong on that street. At the sight of 2 weapons raised on a woman standing with her hands lifted and empty. "You never released this," he said when it ended. "Only 40 seconds of it. I wanted to keep something in reserve." "Good instinct." Theodore leaned back. "Now, let's talk about the file they twisted." Kendra pulled up what she remembered of the original training incident, and Theodore filled in the rest from memory, since he'd been the one standing in the room when it happened years earlier. A live fire exercise gone wrong through no fault of Kendra's own. A teammate had frozen under pressure, weapon still raised on a role player during a hostage scenario drill. Kendra had stepped in, disarmed him safely, prevented what could have been a serious training injury. The official file noted it as an unusual intervention requiring review. It had ended in a commendation for exceptional judgment under pressure, not a mark against her. Oscar's people took a citation for restraint and turned it into a smear, Theodore said. That's not hard to disprove. I can authenticate your full record through proper channels. Official request, verified through the Department of Defense, impossible for anyone to dismiss as spin or hearsay. It'll take a day, maybe two, to get it processed properly. Then what? Then we make sure it lands somewhere Oscar can't quietly bury it. Kendra thought for a moment, turning it over. There's a city council meeting in 3 days. Oscar's scheduled to speak, defend the department's handling of everything publicly. Maddow mentioned it before her editor pulled her story. Theodore's eyes sharpened. That's our target. They spent the rest of the day building it out, piece by piece, the way Kendra had once helped plan operations that depended on timing more than firepower. The full dash cam footage showing everything the 40-second clip had left out. Kendra's authenticated service record arriving through official channels that couldn't be dismissed. And buried in the footage's metadata, something Kendra had noticed only after reviewing it a dozen times, a timestamp discrepancy between her own recording and the department's official incident report, proof that Oscar's office had altered the report after the fact to match Blakely and Kaiser's coordinated statements. If we release it during the meeting itself, Theodore said, he won't have time to control it. No press conference to prepare for, no friendly reporter to call ahead of time. Just him, standing at that podium, with the truth landing in the room at the same moment he's trying to defend a lie. And Tessa Maddow? Send it to her the same moment. Her editor pulled the follow-up story over legal exposure. He won't pull it once the footage is already public and verified. Nobody wants to be the last outlet holding the truth back. Kendra nodded slowly, feeling something settle into place in her chest for the first time in days. Not hope, exactly. Something steadier than hope. A plan, built entirely from pieces she already had. Nothing borrowed, nothing left to chance. 3 days, she said. 3 days, Theodore agreed. And Vandel, when it happens, let it happen exactly like we planned. No improvising. No losing your temper in that room, no matter what they say to provoke you. You've already proven what you're capable of once. Let the evidence finish the job this time. Kendra closed her laptop, the full footage saved and ready. Her service record already requested through the proper channels. Everything precisely where it needed to be. Oscar was standing at a podium in 3 days, ready to defend a story built entirely on lies. He had no idea it was about to collapse underneath him in front of the whole town. The council chamber filled up fast that evening, folding chairs pulled out to the back wall to hold the overflow crowd. Word had spread through the week that Chief Oscar planned to address the department's handling of the Vandel case directly, and half the town seemed to have shown up to hear it, along with 3 news cameras set up along the side aisle. Kendra sat near the back with Theodore beside her, her laptop closed on her knees, phone in hand, everything ready. Tessa Maddow sat 2 rows ahead, notebook open, watching the podium with the sharp, patient look of someone who suspected tonight might not go the way anyone in the room expected. Grace Halton sat near the front with the other officials, arms crossed, waiting. At 7 o'clock sharp, Chief Oscar stepped up to the podium. "Thank you all for coming," he began, voice smooth, practiced, the same careful cadence he'd used on the news 2 weeks earlier. "I want to address the recent incident on Maple Ridge Lane directly, and put some of the community's concerns to rest. Our officers responded appropriately to a developing situation. Questions have since been raised about the individual's background, and I understand the department has been criticized for how we handled the release of information. I take responsibility for any confusion that caused, but I want to be clear. Our officers acted within department policy, and the facts, when fully examined, support that. Kendra's jaw tightened. Beside her, Theodore gave the smallest nod. She looked down at her phone and pressed send. The full dashcam footage went out in that instant, delivered simultaneously to Tessa Maddow's inbox, to Grace Halton's office email, and uploaded live to a public link Kendra had prepared days earlier. At the same moment, a technician near the council chamber's side wall, arranged through Maddow's contacts, pulled the footage up on the room's projector screen. The same screen Oscar had planned to use for his own prepared slides. The room went quiet, then loud, all at once. 2 minutes of unedited footage played across the wall behind Oscar's head. The weapons raised, Kendra's hands lifted and empty, Blakely's voice clear and unmistakable, telling her she didn't belong on that street. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Phones rose across the room, recording the recording, the whole thing about to multiply 100 times over before the meeting even ended. Oscar spun toward the screen, face draining of color. Turn that off. Turn that off right now. It's already been sent to every outlet in this city, Chief. Maddow stood from her seat, voice carrying clear across the chamber. Along with a timestamp comparison showing your department's official incident report was altered 3 days after the original stop to match Officer Blakely and Officer Kaiser's statements. That's a fabrication, Oscar snapped, gripping the podium. That footage has been edited, manipulated. It hasn't. Colonel Theodore rose from his seat beside Kendra, his voice cutting through the room with the flat, unshakable authority of a man used to being obeyed. I've authenticated Sergeant Vandel's full service record through official Department of Defense channels, request number on file as of this morning. The training incident your office leaked to the press was not a disciplinary mark. It was a commendation for exceptional judgment under pressure. Your office took a citation for restraint and turned it into a smear, Chief Oscar. And I have the paperwork to prove every word of that, right here, tonight, in front of this room. He held up a folder, thick with official letterhead, and set it down on the small table beside the council members with a sound that seemed to echo through the stunned silence. Oscar stood frozen at the podium, mouth open, no prepared line left that fit what was happening in front of him. He looked toward the crowd, toward the cameras, toward Halton sitting with her arms still crossed, watching him now with an expression that had nothing left of patience in it. "Chief," Halton said, standing slowly, voice steady and cold, "I think you need to explain to this room exactly when your department altered that incident report, and why." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, growing louder, angrier, as more people finished watching the footage on their own phones, the truth spreading through the room faster than Oscar could ever hope to contain it now. Kendra sat perfectly still in the back row, watching the man who'd tried to bury her under a lie stand exposed in front of the entire town, his careful story collapsing in real time with nowhere left to hide it. Beside her, Theodore leaned close. "Slow and precise," he murmured, "just like we planned." The chamber hadn't settled since Theodore's folder hit the table. Phones stayed raised. The projector screen still glowed behind Oscar, frozen on a paused frame of Blakely's raised weapon, and nobody in that room could look away from it, including Oscar himself. Grace Halton crossed the floor toward the podium, her voice carrying over the noise without needing to shout. "Chief Oscar, is Officer Blakely present tonight?" Oscar's mouth worked without sound for a moment. Near the side aisle, Blakely sat stiff in a folding chair, back rigid, jaw clenched so tight the muscle in his cheek jumped. He hadn't expected to be called on. He'd come to watch his chief clear the department's name, not to be dragged into the center of it. "Officer Blakely," Halton said, turning toward him now, every camera in the room swinging with her. "Would you like to explain to this room why you told an unarmed woman standing with her hands raised that she didn't belong on that street?" Silence stretched a beat too long. "She matched a suspect description," Blakely finally said, but his voice cracked halfway through, thin and unconvincing, in a room that had just watched 2 minutes of footage proving otherwise. "The vehicle didn't match any suspect description," Halton said. "That much is already confirmed in your own department's records, filed the same week as the stop. Try again." Blakely's composure, already worn thin from weeks of suspension and reinstatement, and the slow, grinding pressure of a story he couldn't control, finally snapped in front of the cameras. "She had a gun in that car," he shouted, standing now, finger jabbing toward the frozen image still glowing on the screen behind him. "In a neighborhood like that, driving a car like that, what was I supposed to think? People like her don't just—" He stopped himself, half a second too late. The words hung in the air, ugly and unmistakable, exactly the kind of thing Oscar had spent 2 weeks and a career's worth of favors trying to keep buried. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman gasped audibly. Cameras clicked. Reporters' pens moved fast across their notebooks. Blakely seemed to realize what he'd just said in front of every microphone in the room, and the color drained from his face as fast as it had risen. Halton didn't blink. "Thank you, Officer Blakely. That's more than enough." She turned to the 2 uniformed deputies stationed near the chamber's side door, deputies who answered to her office rather than Oscar's department. "Place Officer Blakely and Officer Kaiser under arrest. Falsification of official police reports and violation of civil rights. Pending formal charges from the grand jury, I intend to reopen first thing tomorrow morning." The room erupted. Deputies moved through the crowd toward Kaiser, who sat frozen, and toward Blakely, who took 1 step back before seeming to understand there was nowhere left to go. Cameras captured every second of it, cuffs closing around both men's wrists in front of the same council chamber where Oscar had planned to declare the matter closed. Oscar still stood at the podium, gripping its edges like it was the only thing holding him upright. He looked out at the room, at Halton, at the deputies, at the cameras that would carry this footage to every household in the city by morning, and something in his face finally gave way. "I'll be submitting my resignation," he said quietly, voice stripped of all the smooth confidence it had carried 20 minutes earlier. "Effective immediately." He stepped back from the podium without waiting for a response, without looking at the council members, without looking at Blakely or Kaiser as they were led past him in handcuffs. He simply walked out the side door, alone, leaving 22 years of careful reputation collapsing behind him in real time. Kendra sat in the back row, watching it all unfold, feeling something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight since the moment 2 guns were raised on her on Maple Ridge Lane. She didn't stand. She didn't cheer with the rest of the room. She simply watched, steady and quiet, as the truth finished the work she'd started with a single warning shot weeks earlier. Beside her, Theodore said nothing at all. He didn't need to. Across the chamber, Tessa Maddow was already typing, thumbs flying across her phone, the story writing itself faster than she could keep up with it. And in the front row, Grace Halton closed the folder Theodore had handed her, straightened it neatly on the table, and looked back once toward Kendra with something that looked almost like an apology, and almost like respect. The days after the council meeting moved fast, faster than anything since the morning Kendra had first seen those lights in her rearview mirror. Grace Halton's office released a formal statement the following afternoon, clearing Kendra of all wrongdoing and formally closing the internal investigation Oscar had opened against her. The grand jury reconvened that same week, this time with a case built on footage nobody could dismiss and a service record nobody could twist. Indictments against Blakely and Kaiser followed within days, falsifying official reports, violating Kendra's civil rights, and, for Blakely, an additional charge tied to the intimidation drive-bys past her mother's house. Tessa Maddow's story ran nationally by the end of that week, picked up by outlets far beyond the small local paper that had first tried to bury Kendra under a lie. The headline this time told the truth plainly. No allegedly, no reportedly softening every sentence. Just the facts, laid out clean, the way they should have been from the very beginning. Colonel Theodore made sure of one more thing before he flew back out. He requested time at the next public council session, and this time nobody tried to stop him from speaking. He stood at the same podium where Oscar had once tried to defend a lie, and read Kendra's full commendation aloud, word for word, unedited. The same citation the department had twisted into a smear weeks earlier. Exceptional judgment under pressure. Restraint that prevented harm to a fellow soldier. A record of discipline that Oscar had tried to turn into a weapon against her, now read into the official record exactly as it had always been written. Kendra sat in the front row this time, not the back. Her mother sat beside her, hand resting over Kendra's on the armrest, tears standing in her eyes that she didn't bother hiding anymore. The new interim chief, appointed within days of Oscar's resignation, announced a full review of department policy, promising outside oversight and independent investigation of use-of-force complaints going forward. Whether any of that promise held over time wasn't something Kendra could control. She'd learned that lesson a long time ago. You could win the battle in front of you, but the next one was never fully finished. Somebody always had to keep watching. For now, though, this battle was over, and she had won it. 2 weeks later, Kendra drove to the courthouse one final time for Blakely's arraignment. She hadn't planned to attend at first. Her leave was almost up, orders waiting for her back at Bragg, a life beyond Maple Ridge Lane calling her back to it. But something pulled her there that morning anyway. Some need to see the last piece of it through with her own eyes, rather than reading about it later in Maddow's follow-up article. She stood near the courthouse steps as deputies led Blakely out in cuffs, jumpsuit replacing the uniform he'd worn like armor the day he'd raised his weapon on her. He looked smaller now, older. Whatever certainty had let him stand on that street and tell her she didn't belong there had drained out of him completely, leaving something hollow behind in its place. Their eyes met for just a moment as the deputies walked him past. Kendra didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say that the evidence, the record, and the room full of witnesses at that council meeting hadn't already said far more clearly than words ever could. She'd learned that lesson from Theodore a long time ago, back on some dusty range at Bragg. Sometimes the loudest statement was the one you didn't need to make out loud at all. She simply lifted her hand, slow and deliberate, and rested it once against her hip, the same spot where a legal weapon had never actually been that first afternoon, where a lie had been built out of nothing but fear and assumption, and a 50-year-old story about who belonged on which street. Blakely looked away first. The deputies led him through the courthouse doors, and Kendra turned, walking back down the steps into the bright, ordinary daylight of a town that finally knew the truth. She hadn't needed to fire a single round to win the war. She'd just needed them to underestimate her twice. If you enjoyed the story, leave a like to support my channel, and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. On the screen, I have picked 2 special stories just for you. Have a wonderful day.